So hi, my name's Joe Brewer and I'm a change strategist. And today I want to do a book review on this amazing book right here, Butterfly Economics by Paul Ormerod. The subtitle is A New General Theory of Social and Economic Behavior. And this book would fit into the category of what I would call complexity economics, meaning that Paul is taking a perspective informed by complexity science to explain how economic systems work. And what's really excellent about this book is he flips traditional economic theory on its head. Now, traditional economic theory, I'm really referring to what's called neoclassical economics, which looks at the economic systems as complete gestalts. So there is an economy as a monolithic thing, and you look at its behavior as a monolithic thing, and you have assumptions about how it works. And for those of you who have studied the history of economic scholarship, you'll know that all of the major assumptions of neoclassical economics have been falsified. They don't hold up to the scrutiny of observational experience. And so the question that Paul is asking is, what if we were to instead look at economics from the bottom up? And rather than looking at it as a monolithic, uniform thing, look at it as a collection of small interacting agents that have some relationship to each other, and see how those interactions between a large number of small entities can create the emergent macro scale behavior that we see in economic systems. And so he does this by starting with some fascinating research that's been done with ant colonies, where they would take a colony of ants and give them two food supplies that are equally distant from each other. So if you were to imagine that right here is where the colony is, and then you were to go from it to two locations where there's a pile of sugar, say, and you watch as ants go out to one of the food supplies and leave their little chemical trails to tell the other ants whether or not they found food, that you'll see this fascinating emergent dynamic that at some point in time, there will be a majority, like 80% of the ants will have gone over to the pile that's over here. But then at another time, rather abruptly, 80% will have switched and gone over to the pile that's over here. And there's this chaotic back and forth. They never stabilize into one pile or the other. And if you were to take the average across a large amount of time, you'd find that the ants spend about half their time at each of the piles, but that's not really a useful measure for the amazing complexity and detailed, granular instability and chaos, the turbulence that is seen in the actual behavior of ants. If you take the same way of thinking and apply it to economic systems and look at, say, the way that different firms behave in an economy, where there are some firms that are small and they're rapidly growing, disrupting with new technologies that are causing other firms to go extinct or to go bankrupt and close their doors, where there are firms that are interacting with each other to merge and form conglomerates or to be divided and broken off and sold as pieces, that there are all these interacting patterns that arise, the behaviors between the different firms. And when you look at all of those interacting behaviors together, you're able to see an emergent pattern of behavior, which is the overall behavior of the economic system. So taking this way of thinking, of looking at economies as a bunch of interacting agents who have some rules that determine what their likely strategies are and how they interact with each other, that you can run modeling and simulation studies using a computer to see the behaviors that pop out. And he gives some fascinating examples from economic policy that look at social issues. And one that I found especially compelling was a discussion he had about policies that are intended to increase public safety by reducing crime on the streets. And what he showed was that in certain economic conditions, where you have a measure of, say, a 10% rate of some kind of crime, like, say, people breaking into houses, that if you introduce a certain policy into that environment, it will reduce the amount of crime. But in another situation that has a different set of background conditions, where the crime rate is exactly the same, meaning that 10% of the houses are being broken into in a given period of time, that if you introduce the same policy, crime rates will go up. Now, what's going on where the same policy leads to opposite outcomes? It turns out that these interacting localized behaviors, in this case, the way that the policy influences the behavior of people in the market, in the economic system, that in certain contexts it will reduce crime, in other contexts it will incentivize indirectly other forms of activity that lead to increases in crime. And so the thing that we can take away from this is that anyone who claims that an economic policy is going to only have one behavioral outcome for economies is someone you might want to be at least skeptical of and look more closely at the way that the patterns of human interaction lead to the macro scale statistical behavior of that system. And that this complexity approach that looks at the interacting parts to see how the macro behavior emerges will tell you whether a policy is appropriate to a given context or not. Now, clearly, this is a very different way of thinking about economic policy and economic planning, a very different way of thinking about how to interpret statistics, where specifically you do not treat statistics as standalone measurements, but instead you contextualize them to the emerging patterns of behavior in the system when you're making the measurement. And if you have an understanding of what the behaviors are at the smaller scale that are leading to that emergent pattern, then you'll have some predictive ability about what that metric means. But if you don't have an understanding of how the metric maps to these more granular dynamic interactions and the evolving pattern of the social system, then you may interpret the measurement incorrectly and introduce a policy tool that is inappropriate to the situation at hand. So thinking in this way is very different from how economic policy has been done in the past. It's a great example of how complexity science can transform how we think about economic policy and economic theory. And so I really encourage you to go and get your own copy of this book, Butterfly Economics, and learn more. Enjoy.